In 1953, a country that the entire free world had shunned as a fascist relic of the Second World War suddenly found itself shaking hands with the most powerful democracy on earth. A dictator who had once flirted with Hitler and Mussolini was about to become one of Washington's most strategically valuable allies. This is the story of how Madrid and Washington built a partnership across the Atlantic, a partnership built not on shared values, but on fear, geography, and the cold calculations of a world divided by the Iron Curtain. It is a story of isolation turned into opportunity, of ideology bent by necessity, and of a friendship that would reshape Spain's destiny for the next 40 years. The story of the Atlantic Partnership between Madrid and Washington cannot begin in 1953. It must begin years earlier, in the smoking ruins of a Europe that had just finished tearing itself apart. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the victorious Allied powers turned their attention to the men and regimes that had aided or sympathized with the Axis cause. Franco, the general who had won Spain's brutal civil war in 1939 with direct military assistance from Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, was high on that list of suspects. Franco's Spain had never formally joined the Axis as a belligerent. He had kept his nation technically neutral during the World War, sending only token forces, the so-called Blue Division, to fight alongside Germany on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. But neutrality was a thin disguise. Franco's regime had been born from fascist sympathies, sustained by fascist weapons, and modeled in many ways on fascist aesthetics. When the war ended, the world remembered. In December 1946, the newly formed United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the Franco government. Member states were urged to withdraw their ambassadors from Madrid. Spain was frozen out of the emerging post-war order. It would not receive Marshall Plan aid when that massive American Reconstruction program launched in 1947. It would not be invited to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization when that alliance was formed in 1949. For the architects of the new Western world, Spain was untouchable, a fascist holdout in a Europe trying to remake itself as a community of democracies. For Franco, this isolation was both a humiliation and an existential threat. His regime had no natural allies. The Soviet Union despised him as a fascist. Britain and France, though anti-communist, refused to legitimize a dictator who reminded them too vividly of the enemy they had just defeated. The United States under President Harry Truman maintained a policy of distant disapproval, unwilling to openly embrace the caudillo but equally unwilling to actively topple him. Franco understood that his survival depended on finding a crack in this wall of hostility, and he was patient enough to wait for one to appear. That crack arrived from an unexpected direction, the deepening confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, the Cold War hardened into the defining struggle of the era. Washington's foreign policy establishment increasingly viewed the world through a single lens, containment of communism, and that lens had a way of reordering moral priorities. An anti-communist dictator, however distasteful, began to look different from a Western European democracy's perspective than from a Pentagon planning room obsessed with Soviet expansion. Spain possessed something the Pentagon found irresistible: geography. Sitting at the gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea, controlling the approaches to Gibraltar, and offering vast, sparsely populated terrain ideal for air bases, Spain was a strategist's dream. American military planners studying potential Soviet invasion scenarios for Western Europe began to see the Iberian Peninsula as a crucial fallback position, a redoubt from which NATO forces could regroup if continental Europe fell, and a forward base from which American bombers could threaten Soviet territory. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 accelerated this strategic reassessment dramatically. Suddenly the Cold War was not an abstraction, it was a shooting war on the other side of the world, and American planners began calculating worst-case scenarios for a wider conflict. Spain's potential value as a military asset surged. Even as the moral case against Franco remained as strong as ever, the practical case for cooperating with him grew stronger by the month. Franco watched these shifts with calculated patience. He understood that his regime's survival was now intertwined with American strategic anxiety, and he played this hand skillfully. Spanish diplomats began quietly signaling Washington that Madrid was ready, even eager, to offer bases and cooperation, no ideological concessions required. Only a strategic transaction. The first formal steps toward rapprochement came carefully, almost reluctantly, from the American side. In 1948 and 1949, financial and trade agreements were quietly worked out between Spain and France and Britain, signaling a thaw even among Spain's European critics. In early 1949, Spain received its first American bank loan, a modest $25 million, but symbolically enormous, representing the first crack in the wall of financial isolation. Around the same time, the chairman of the powerful United States Senate Armed Services Committee made a visit to Spain, a clear signal that voices within the American defense establishment saw value in engaging Franco's government regardless of the State Department's discomfort. By 1950, what historians often call the rehabilitation of the Franco regime was effectively underway. The United Nations reversed its earlier condemnation, allowing member states to normalize diplomatic relations with Madrid once more. Ambassadors who had been withdrawn in 1946 began trickling back. The wall was not yet gone, but it had a door in it, and that door was opening because of pure Cold War calculation rather than any change in Franco's authoritarian character. The election of Dwight D. Eisenhower as President of the United States in 1952 proved decisive. Eisenhower, a former Supreme Allied commander who understood military logistics and strategic geography intimately, had none of his predecessors' lingering moral hesitation about engaging Franco. His administration appointed James Dunn as ambassador to Madrid, a diplomat known for being considerably more flexible and accommodating toward Spanish demands than his predecessors had been. The stage was now set for serious negotiations. In July 1951, even before Eisenhower's election, a significant preliminary step had already occurred. The United States Chief of Naval Operations traveled to Madrid and met personally with Franco, reaching a preliminary understanding on military cooperation. This meeting demonstrated that elements of the American military, separate from the more cautious civilian diplomatic corps, were eager to move forward regardless of the political sensitivities involved. Formal negotiations began in April 1952. The American delegation was led by General August Kissner, representing military interests, and George Train, handling economic matters. The Spanish delegation was headed by General Juan Viggen, a trusted Franco loyalist with deep military credentials. For more than a year, these negotiators hammered out the details of what would become one of the most consequential bilateral agreements of Franco's entire rule. The negotiations were not without friction. Spain wanted these agreements structured as a formal treaty, a designation that would have carried greater prestige and implied a deeper, more equal alliance, comparable to NATO membership. The Americans, however, understood a crucial political reality: a formal treaty would require ratification by the United States Senate, and given the widespread public disapproval of Franco's dictatorship that still existed among the American electorate, such ratification was far from guaranteed. Eisenhower's negotiators chose instead the path of executive agreements, arrangements made directly between governments that did not require congressional approval. This was a pragmatic, almost cynical solution. It allowed Washington to secure everything it strategically needed from Spain while sidestepping the messy democratic debate that a treaty vote would have triggered. This choice reveals something important about the entire Atlantic Partnership from its very inception. It was never conceived as a partnership of equals bound by shared democratic values. It was a transaction, bases and strategic depth in exchange for aid and legitimacy, carefully designed to avoid the scrutiny that genuine democratic accountability might have imposed. Both governments understood this. Franco wanted the legitimacy of being treated as a respectable ally. Washington wanted the practical military assets without the political cost of openly endorsing a dictatorship. As 1953 progressed, the negotiating teams in Madrid finalized the details. The agreements would cover three distinct areas: the provision of American war material to the Spanish armed forces, broader economic assistance including loans and grants, and, most consequentially, the establishment of American military bases on Spanish soil. Each component served a different purpose, but together they would bind Spain's fortunes to Washington's strategic priorities for decades. By September 1953, everything was ready. The decade of isolation that had begun with the United Nations condemnation in 1946 was about to end, not because Franco had reformed his regime in any meaningful way, but because the world had changed around him. The Cold War had created an opening, and both sides were about to walk through it. On September 26, 1953, in the Spanish capital, representatives of the United States and Spain put their signatures to three executive agreements that would become known collectively as the Pact of Madrid, though some contemporary accounts and later summaries placed the signing date as September 23, a discrepancy historians attribute to differences between the date of finalization and the date of public announcement and ceremony. What is certain is that within this short span of late September 1953, Franco's Spain completed its journey from international pariah to American strategic partner. The substance of the agreements was extensive. The first dealt with the provision of American war material to the Spanish armed forces, tanks, artillery, vehicles, and naval vessels that would modernize a military still largely equipped with aging Civil War-era and Second World War surplus equipment. The list of equipment delivered under this and subsequent agreements reads like a catalog of American Cold War hardware: M47 and M48 Patton tanks, M24 Chaffee light tanks, M41 Walker Bulldog tanks, various American howitzers, half-tracks, and trucks. Spain's Navy, too, would benefit, receiving modernization assistance for several classes of destroyers and frigates, submarines, and eventually even an aircraft carrier, the Daedalus. The second agreement addressed economic assistance, loans and grants that would help stabilize Spain's struggling post-war economy. Estimates of the total value of this aid, including subsequent disbursements over the following years, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, with some accounts citing over $200 million in initial commitments and later cumulative aid eventually exceeding $1 billion across the life of the broader relationship. For a Spanish economy that had been stagnating under decades of autarkic policy and international isolation, this was a transformative infusion of capital. The third agreement was the most consequential, and the one that would define the relationship for the next 4 decades, the Defense Agreement, which authorized the United States to develop, maintain, and use military bases on Spanish territory. The agreement's language was carefully crafted to preserve Spanish sovereignty on paper, the bases would technically be Spanish facilities used jointly with American forces under Spanish jurisdiction, but in practice, Washington gained an extraordinary degree of operational control over installations that would become central to American Cold War strategy in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. For installations emerged as the heart of this new American military presence in Spain, Naval Station Rota on the Atlantic coast near Cadiz, which would become a critical port and submarine base, and 3 air bases, Moron, Torrejon, and Zaragoza, which would host American bomber and fighter squadrons capable of projecting power across the Mediterranean and, if necessary, deep into Soviet territory. These were not minor outposts. They represented a permanent American military footprint on Spanish soil, one that would persist in various forms long after Franco himself had died. The strategic logic behind these installations was straightforward to American planners. Naval Station Rota offered a deep-water port position perfectly to support operations in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic approaches to Europe. The air bases, particularly Torrejon near Madrid, gave American Strategic Air Command bombers a forward staging point far closer to potential Soviet targets than bases in the continental United States could provide. In an era when nuclear deterrence depended heavily on the credible ability to strike quickly, Spanish soil offered geography that money could not easily replicate elsewhere. For Franco, the political payoff of the Pact of Madrid was immense, arguably exceeding even the material benefits. His own public statements made clear how he understood the agreement's significance. In an October 1953 message to the Cortes, Spain's rubber-stamped parliament, Franco described the agreements as inaugurating a policy of, in his words, stable friendship between Spain and the United States. While insisting that Spain's own ideology and sovereignty remained intact. This was Franco's preferred narrative, not a dictator desperately seeking validation from a democracy, but an equal partner choosing cooperation on his own terms. The reality, as American diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals, was more complicated and considerably less flattering to Franco's self-image. Internal State Department assessments noted that while Franco frequently invoked Spain's new role in Western defense, he showed little genuine interest in embracing the broader multilateral defense framework represented by NATO, preferring instead the narrower, more controllable bilateral relationship with Washington alone. American diplomats observed that Spain's foreign policy under Franco remained fundamentally inward-looking and bilateral, oriented toward extracting maximum benefit from the United States while avoiding the broader entanglements and obligations of true multilateral alliance membership. The domestic reaction within Spain to the Pact of Madrid was far from universally positive, despite the regime's triumphant public framing. The Falangist press, led by the party organ Arriba, devoted extensive coverage to the agreements, printing the full text of the public portions across several pages and crediting Franco personally as the visionary architect of Spain's diplomatic triumph. This coverage framed the pact as compensation for the supposed righteousness of Franco's wartime neutrality and a vindication of his entire foreign policy approach since 1939. But beneath this state-sponsored celebration, currents of genuine domestic opposition existed, even if they could not be expressed openly under Franco's authoritarian censorship. Anarchist, socialist, and Republican opposition groups, the defeated remnants of the Spanish Civil War's losing side, many still in exile or operating underground, viewed the pact with deep suspicion and hostility. For them, the agreement represented something troubling, the strengthening and international legitimization of the very dictatorship they had fought against, now achieved through American complicity. Some domestic critics, even within circles closer to the regime, worried the agreement was fundamentally asymmetrical, granting Washington enormous strategic advantages on Spanish soil while committing Spain to potential involvement in American-led conflicts without corresponding guarantees of American support if Spain itself were attacked. This asymmetry was not merely a perception, it was built into the structure of the agreements. Unlike NATO's Article 5 mutual defense guarantee, the Pact of Madrid created no reciprocal obligation for the United States to defend Spain in the event of an attack. Washington gained military access and strategic depth, Spain received aid and a measure of international rehabilitation, but no binding security guarantee. This imbalance would remain a persistent point of Spanish frustration in the decades that followed, as successive Spanish governments, eventually including post-Franco democratic administrations, sought unsuccessfully and then successfully to renegotiate the relationship onto more equal footing. The international reaction to the Pact of Madrid was swift and significant. Western European ambassadors who had withdrawn from Madrid years earlier began returning. Spain's path toward membership in international organizations accelerated dramatically. Within just over 2 years, in December 1955, Spain achieved a milestone that had seemed unimaginable a decade earlier: admission to the United Nations, the very organization that had formally condemned Franco's regime in 1946. The transformation from pariah to partner was now complete, at least in the eyes of the international diplomatic community, even though Franco's domestic governance remained as authoritarian as ever. The Pact of Madrid was not a single moment frozen in time, it was the foundation for a relationship that would evolve, strain, and renegotiate itself continuously over the following decades. Understanding the Atlantic Partnership requires looking beyond 1953 to see how this initial bargain shaped Spanish and American interests for a generation. In the years immediately following the pact, the American military presence in Spain expanded steadily. Construction crews descended on Rota, Moron, Torrejon, and Zaragoza, transforming what had often been modest existing facilities or open countryside into sophisticated military installations. American technicians, engineers, and logistics specialists worked alongside Spanish counterparts, and a small but significant American expatriate community began to take root around these bases, a community that would, over time, introduce subtle threads of American culture into the surrounding Spanish towns, from consumer goods to music to the English language itself. For Franco's government, the economic dimension of the relationship proved transformative. Spain in the early 1950s remained mired in the economic consequences of decades of autarkic policy, the self-sufficiency doctrine Franco had pursued partly out of ideological conviction and partly out of necessity during the years of international isolation. American aid, arriving in the form of loans, grants, and eventually expanded trade relationships, provided crucial capital for infrastructure projects, agricultural modernization, and the gradual liberalization of an economy that had been suffocating under state control. This economic relationship deepened further as the decade progressed. Spain began shifting away from strict autarky toward a more open economic model, a transition that historians often trace partly to the technocratic influence of officials within Franco's government who recognized that genuine economic development required engagement with international markets and capital, engagement that the American relationship had helped make possible. The Stabilization Plan of 1959, while driven primarily by domestic Spanish technocrats and institutions like the International Monetary Fund, occurred within a broader context of Western economic integration that the 1953 agreements had helped initiate. Diplomatically, the relationship continued to pay dividends for Franco's international standing throughout the late 1950s and into the 1960s. American presidents, even those personally uncomfortable with the optics of associating with an authoritarian regime, found themselves bound by the strategic logic their predecessors had established. President Eisenhower himself visited Madrid in December 1959, becoming the first sitting American president to set foot in Franco's Spain, a visit that, regardless of its careful diplomatic framing, served as a powerful symbol of Spain's rehabilitation. Crowds in Madrid reportedly turned out in significant numbers to greet Eisenhower, a moment Franco's propaganda machine eagerly amplified as proof of Spain's restored international standing. Yet beneath the surface of mutual strategic benefit, friction persisted. The base agreements required periodic renewal and renegotiation, and each round of talks became an opportunity for Spain to press for better terms. Franco's government consistently sought greater compensation, more advanced military equipment, and, perhaps most importantly from Madrid's perspective, some form of binding security guarantee comparable to NATO's mutual defense commitments. The United States, however, remained reluctant to extend such guarantees to a regime it could not formally admit into the NATO alliance itself, given the continued political sensitivities surrounding Franco's dictatorship among other NATO member democracies. This dynamic created a recurring pattern across subsequent decades, Spain providing strategic real estate and military access, the United States providing aid and diplomatic cover, but never quite elevating Spain to genuinely equal alliance status. Successive renewal agreements in 1963, 1970, and beyond would each attempt to address these asymmetries to varying degrees. With Spain gradually extracting somewhat improved terms as its negotiating leverage grew alongside its economic development and Western European integration prospects. The 1960s brought additional complications to the relationship. The Vietnam War, increasingly controversial both in the United States and internationally, created occasional friction over how American bases in Spain might be used to support operations elsewhere in the world, concerns that touched on the original asymmetry of an agreement that gave Washington broad operational latitude while offering Spain no reciprocal voice in how that latitude might be exercised. A serious incident in January 1966, when an American B-52 bomber collided with a refueling tanker over the Spanish coastal town of Palomares, releasing radioactive contamination from the nuclear weapons it carried, created a genuine crisis in the relationship. The Palomares incident underscored, in the starkest possible terms, the risk Spain had assumed by hosting American military operations, risks that existed precisely because of the basing arrangements established in 1953. The Palomares accident required years of cleanup efforts and generated lasting Spanish public anxiety about the American military presence, even as the Franco government worked to manage the diplomatic fallout quietly rather than risk destabilizing the broader strategic relationship. It was a vivid illustration of how the original 1953 bargain, strategic access in exchange for aid, carried hidden costs that ordinary Spanish citizens, rather than the regime's negotiators, often bore most directly. Despite these tensions, the fundamental architecture of the relationship endured. Franco's regime continued to rely on American support as a pillar of its international legitimacy and domestic economic strategy until the very end of his rule. When Franco died in November 1975, the basing agreements he had negotiated more than 2 decades earlier remained substantially intact, a testament to how durable the original Cold War logic underlying the Atlantic Partnership had proven to be. The transition to Spanish democracy following Franco's death introduced a new chapter in this relationship, one that ultimately allowed Spain to renegotiate its position from a place of much greater strength. As Spain moved toward democratic governance under King Juan Carlos and subsequent elected governments, the basing relationship with the United States persisted, but the political context surrounding it changed entirely. A democratic Spain could engage with Washington as a genuine partner rather than as a dictatorship seeking legitimacy, and this shift would eventually pave the way for Spain's accession to NATO itself in 1982, the very multilateral framework that Franco's bilateral approach had always studiously avoided embracing. The legacy of the Pact of Madrid and the broader Atlantic Partnership between Spain and the United States extends far beyond the specific terms of any single agreement. It represents a case study in how Cold War strategic necessity could override ideological consistency, reshaping the international standing of an authoritarian regime that, by any conventional measure, should have remained a pariah. Consider the moral complexity at the heart of this story. The United States, the self-proclaimed leader of the free world and the democratic alternative to Soviet totalitarianism, chose to forge a close military partnership with one of Europe's last fascist-adjacent dictatorships, justified entirely by strategic calculation rather than shared values. This was not a unique episode in Cold War history. Washington made similar accommodations with authoritarian regimes across Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East throughout this period, but the Spanish case is particularly striking because Franco's regime had so recently and so directly been condemned by the international community, including by the United States itself, for its association with the very Axis powers that the Allies had just defeated. Historians continue to debate how to weigh the consequences of this partnership. From one perspective, the Pact of Madrid provided Franco's regime with exactly the lifeline it needed to survive for another 2 decades, granting it international legitimacy, economic resources, and military hardware that helped sustain an authoritarian system that suppressed political dissent, restricted civil liberties, and maintained a one-party state long after most of Western Europe had embraced democratic pluralism. Critics of the partnership, both at the time and in subsequent historical analysis, argue that American strategic interests effectively propped up a dictatorship that would otherwise have faced mounting internal and external pressure to liberalize or collapse. From another perspective, defenders of the realist Cold War logic that drove American policy argue that the strategic stakes of the era left little room for moral purity. With the Soviet Union representing what American policymakers genuinely believed was an existential threat to Western civilization, the practical military value of Spanish bases, air power capable of reaching deep into Soviet territory, naval access controlling the Mediterranean's western gateway, was simply too significant to sacrifice on ideological grounds. This argument holds that American policymakers were managing a dangerous, bipolar world with imperfect tools, and that demanding ideological consistency from every strategic partnership would have left the United States dangerously weakened in a conflict where the stakes were nothing less than the survival of the democratic world order itself. Both perspectives contain genuine merit, and serious historians have generally avoided reducing this complex episode to a simple morality tale in either direction. What is less disputed is the practical impact the relationship had on Spain's own historical trajectory. The economic aid and gradual exposure to American-style market integration that flowed from the 1953 agreements contributed to a broader transformation of the Spanish economy throughout the late 1950s and 1960s, a transformation that, while driven by many factors beyond the American relationship alone, helped lay groundwork for the economic modernization that would eventually support Spain's transition to democracy after Franco's death. There is also a strategic legacy that persisted well beyond the Cold War's end. The American military bases established under the 1953 agreements, particularly Naval Station Rota and Moron Air Base, remain active American military installations to this day, now operating under renegotiated agreements between Washington and a fully democratic Spain that is itself a NATO member. Rota, in particular, has taken on renewed strategic significance in the 21st century, serving as a key node for American naval operations, including ballistic missile defense capabilities, in the broader Mediterranean and European security architecture. The physical infrastructure born from Franco's Cold War bargain with Eisenhower continues to serve American and now NATO strategic interests, even though the political context that originally created it has been utterly transformed. This continuity raises a fascinating historical question: how much of contemporary American military posture in Southern Europe still rests on foundations laid not by democratic allies acting in concert, but by a singular transactional bargain struck between a dictator seeking legitimacy and a superpower seeking strategic depth in the early 1950s? The answer suggests that infrastructure and strategic geography, once established, can long outlive the political circumstances of their creation. The Spanish public's relationship with the American military presence has also evolved dramatically since the Franco era. Democratic Spain has periodically renegotiated the terms of American basing rights, generally securing far more favorable and equal terms than Franco's government ever achieved, including formal Spanish parliamentary oversight of base operations that simply did not exist under the dictatorship's executive agreements. Public opinion in Spain regarding American military presence has fluctuated over the decades, occasionally surfacing tensions reminiscent of the original 1953 controversy, questions about sovereignty, the use of Spanish territory for operations Spain itself has no voice in approving, and the balance between security benefits and the costs of hosting foreign military power. What endures most clearly from this history is the lesson it offers about the nature of Cold War alliances more broadly. They were rarely built on shared democratic values alone, but frequently on hard calculations of strategic necessity that could elevate even the most internationally condemned regimes into valuable partners when geography and timing aligned correctly. The Atlantic Partnership between Madrid and Washington stands as one of the clearest examples of this pattern, a relationship forged not despite Franco's authoritarianism, but essentially indifferent to it, in service of a larger struggle that both governments believed mattered more than ideological consistency. Today, as Spain and the United States maintain their alliance within the broader NATO framework, the origins of their military cooperation in the calculated transaction of 1953 are often forgotten or glossed over in favor of a simpler narrative of enduring transatlantic friendship. But the historical record tells a more complicated story, one of isolation transformed into opportunity, of moral compromise driven by strategic fear, and of a partnership whose foundations were built not on the bedrock of shared democratic ideals, but on the shifting sands of Cold War necessity. Understanding this origin does not diminish the genuine strategic and economic value the relationship eventually provided to both nations. It simply demands that we view the Atlantic Partnership with the full complexity history actually contains.